your viewport seeing the presentation only as a small thumbnail, what you could do is just hover over that little thumbnail of the screen and click on the little pin, which will make the presentation go full screen. And then you can see all the nice images in perfect condition. Yes, so as Rob mentioned, the section is on contemporary art. It's a very exciting degree. It's a very unique degree. There aren't really other programs like this in the country, as we have purposefully developed this program to be somewhat different to the traditional fine arts degrees that you might find at the larger kind of universities. So art is a discipline that is as old as mankind, as humankind, and we've long since, as a species, had this real need to express ourselves through kind of image making and various other ways of connecting with ourselves and connecting with the world around us, and kind of making sense of the world through or by means of expression. And that's really the kind of basics in which contemporary art is located. But as I said, this is quite a different program to what you might find at universities, because often what universities offer is what we call fine art. And we've chosen to focus our intention on contemporary art. And what that means is that we really look at the art of the present, the art of the 21st century. So despite looking at the roots of art making practices in kind of by looking at the history of art and more traditional developments in art, we really focus on honing our attention and skills towards what is the art world of the 21st century in all of its aspects, not just in the making of art aspect, but also in how do we write about art, how do we speak about art, how do we curate art for the context of the museum or the gallery, how do we advise corporate collectors on the buying of art, how do we look at the value of artworks in terms of their primary value, in terms of the secondary market where artworks might be resold on auction, how do auction houses function, how do art fairs function. If we think, for example, of the International Cape Town Art Fair or the FNB Joburg Art Fair, these are all very important sites of art happening that's relevant to our contemporary context. And we look at all of these as a kind of integrated system of art, which is a super excited world. So let me start off by just taking you through to some of the subjects that make up this degree. As we've mentioned before, the contemporary art degree is a kind of standalone program where there's a lot more cross-pollination that happens between the three different design degrees. The contemporary art degree is a kind of unit in and of itself, and it's made up of several different types of subjects. So the subjects that are shared with design students, as mentioned before, is contextual studies and academic skills. And then there's certain individual subjects that are specifically pertinent to contemporary art that I'm going to take you through one by one. So in contextual studies, as Desiree mentioned earlier, we look at the kind of theoretical and conceptual underpinnings of the cultural world, whether that might be in relation to film or design or media or art. We look at the kind of thinking that is required for us to understand the art world, understand the design world, to kind of critically engage with questions that come up in the social political context that we find ourselves. So these are some of the topics that we deal with. Then looking at the primary subject in contemporary art, it's called studio practice. And this is really where we engage with contemporary art making practices. So we look at more traditional forms of art making like drawing and painting and sculpture, but we also look at more contemporary practices like performance art, like working collaboratively with others, like mapping as an art medium, like land art or site-specific art. We look at even writing as a form of artwork. There's certain exercises in which students merely work with words, either through poetry or through titling artworks. We look at the materiality of art making, at unconventional materials that we can use in our art making practice, specifically for their conceptual value. So there's a lot in studio practice that's about really finding or creating the space for each individual student to explore and develop their own artistic practice. As you know, in the art world, there's quite an emphasis on uniqueness on developing a type of art making that is specific to yourself, and developing one's own kind of artistic language and processes. And it's within studio practice that we really move through this process over the duration of the 3 years of the program. So what we do in studio practice is to grow and develop a deeper and more informed understanding of yourself as an artist in the making. So who are you as an artist? What is your practice like? And how does it relate to the contemporary art world and the world at large? So it's a very exciting subject in which you do a lot of exploration before eventually kind of figuring out what specifically does your voice as an artist look like. Alongside this, there's a course called Technical Development, where we really look at the modes of art making from a technical perspective. And this is where we start honing specific skills. We do things like video editing, working in digital software around kind of integrating digital practices in your art making. We look at what is the different approaches we take when we paint with acrylic paint versus oil paint. We look at how to do various modes of printmaking. We look at sculptural processes. How do we mold something in silicone? How do we use paper to create sculpture? We even look at book art. How do we physically bind a book by using needle and thread and to create our own artist books? So there's a lot of different skills that we explore in the program as well. So whereas studio practices, the emphasis is a lot more on the kind of conceptual language that one develops through art, the technical development course is very much about learning the skills that can inform your practice. And these skills, some of them are more traditional art skills like painting and drawing, whereas some other skills are much more contemporary skills like animating, for example, or working in Photoshop or Illustrator or Premiere as a kind of video editing software. So there's a lot of looking at different tools and techniques that span a very wide range of things. So in this subject, you learn all the how-to skills, the techniques and the processes that can support your studio practice, that support the development of your own type of work. So it's typical within the contemporary art program that you might start off in your first year doing a whole range of different things. And then as you move through the second year, and specifically as you get to the third year, you start to create a specific type of work. You start identifying what is the type of work, the type of techniques that suit your specific artistic language. Then another subject that's quite unique to this program is what we call collaborative practice. And this is really emphasizing the importance of working with others in the art world. As I said earlier this morning, for those of you that were in the first session, the kind of myth of the artist as the recluse sitting in his own studio by himself, late at night going crazy, or genius, we're not quite sure which one. That kind of mythology is something that's really outdated, and the art world specifically now relies a lot on collaboration. We find even that kind of very big and famous international contemporary artists don't necessarily even make all of their own work themselves. They work with particular kind of manufacturers or subcontractors or factories or people that form part of the art practice in a very collaborative way. We also find that as artists, we often have to collaborate with a curator on conceptualizing an exhibition together. Or we might find two different artists working together on one project. So there's a lot of collaboration that goes into art making. So we look at this by means of the subject collaborative practice that happens on first and second and third year level. And it often happens by means of putting together little exhibitions where students will be teamed together on conceptualizing either a joint artwork or a joint exhibition where each brings their own artwork and then puts it into the context of one exhibition. So we learn in the subject how to work with other people creatively, which is such a vital skill for the contemporary world. We look at artists, curators, and administrators, and all the different role players in the art world, and how one can foster meaningful relationships in that way. And then professional practice is then where we look at the business side of art. Art in itself is also a business world. There's a kind of whole world of commerce and exchange that supports artistic practices. And we look here at what are the different types of roles we can take on in the art world, what are the different types of career paths that we can take on, and how do each of these suit you as an individual best? So we join in this course on second and third year level, again with the design students, where we then look at business studies to the full extent that I described in the first session today, where we look at working with oneself, working with others, working with money, working within the constraint of the law, all of those things that we need to understand, ranging from tax to intellectual property and contract law. All of these different types of things are types of information that we need to understand in order to be professional artists. Because I think also for very long, or for far too long, we've kind of looked at the artist as someone who's on the fringes of society, someone who's not economically plugged into how the world works. And that is a very outdated idea as well. We've come to realize that there's ways in which artists can have very effective long-term careers without having to have the constant stress for money. There's ways in which artists can build a reputation and build a practice in innovative ways that ensures that they have a successful and a long-term career. So in professional practice, we'll learn how to be professional in the art world. And a lot of this is about developing the self-awareness and resilience that we require in order to be agile enough to respond with a positive attitude to the challenges that we face, and to develop kind of self-critical and problem-solving skills that ensure that we have a long-term successful career. So that's just an outline of what the program looks like in terms of its subjects. So I'd like to also share with you a whole bunch of images that can show you a bit more about how the program's developed. So in a typical year, that's not a year of lockdown as we had this year, there's a lot of interaction in and about the art world. We do a lot of gallery visits. We do a lot of visits to studios. In this instance, this was the beginning of this year, we did a gallery visit where we'd have the artists speak about their work. We would often bring multiple year levels of students together into one visit so as to create discussion amongst each other about the specific work. So there's a lot about getting to know the art world in Cape Town specifically on a very first-hand basis. Learning about how these exhibitions are not only made, but also installed, getting students to write about exhibitions, to speak about exhibitions. And this is a photograph of one of our studios. So a lot in the art program happens in studio when it's a typical year. And you can see from, this is the art studio before the year started, and then a few weeks later, how it's inhabited by the students and how it becomes a very dynamic, very active space in which to work. Here, students were busy with an exercise on color, understanding color and how color and composition works. And you can see that it's a very exciting space to be in the art studio. We also, at the end of each project cycle, which is normally about 4 weeks, we have mini exhibitions, or what we call reviews. And this is where students display their work and are provided the opportunity to get feedback from their lecturers and also from their fellow students. So you'll see in many of these pictures, you might see people working with laptops or working with their mobile phones. It's not that they're busy chatting to friends online. They're actually busy on their cell phones, filling out some feedback reports or giving some feedback to their fellow students on their work. And you can see from the work on display here that there's a wide, diverse amount of work that students produce. We're not very prescriptive in the type of work that you need to produce, as this needs to come from each individual and their own interests and concerns. Here you can see in the various different studios how work is installed and displayed, and about how there's really a sense of community that we foster within the contemporary art program, where students really see each other as almost kind of creative partners in developing their practice and growing from that. So this is some work that's exhibited from the beginning of this year, some work on review, and you can see that there's some more contemporary and some more traditional approaches that follow. So exhibitions is a very big part of how we operate as artists in the world. So we spend quite a lot of time on curating and displaying exhibitions as well throughout the 3 years of the program. So at the end of first year, students often have a first year exhibition that they co-develop, they co-conceptualize, they do the marketing for it, and it's then open to the public. What you see on the screen currently is a third-year exhibition. So at the end of the program, students again have the opportunity to display their work to a kind of broader audience, and they work for a whole year on a body of work that they would then display in a kind of final exhibition. So you can see this is work from different students that have been curated into the studio space, where some people might work very conceptually with alternative materials. We find that other students, like here in the background, work with kind of painting in a very three-dimensional manner, where other students might work with installation that could also have a sound component or a sculptural component. So there's various different ways in which students eventually build their own practice. So as a last section of this presentation, I thought to show you some of the work that students have done this year under lockdown conditions, as we've had to vacate the studios and work online, which has obviously been quite a challenge, but also quite an exciting challenge, in that students had to be very innovative into finding ways of making art in quite a restrictive environment. So these are some of the examples of work that students conceptualized within the confines of lockdown conditions, which for a lot of students led them to do a lot of self-reflection and exploration. This is a series of self-portraits that was developed in a kind of collage format by one of our third-year students, Jeshel. And also using things like video and photography as means to explore kind of conceptual concerns. Some of our students even set up mini exhibitions in their homes where they kind of practice their curating skills by displaying their works and then finding innovative ways of capturing that so that they could share it with their classmates and their lecturers. Some students were inspired by the mundane day-to-day life of lockdown, creating interesting and sculptural objects and drawings. This work was by a second-year student, Brad, who was kind of very inspired is probably not the right word, but overwhelmed by the kind of repetitive nature of living under lockdown, which led him to develop a whole series of works that range from drawings to kind of exploring one's confrontation with oneself through alternative media as well, through kind of drawing and through working with materials, and eventually even by working with Lego. So as you can see, there's a very few limitations that we set in terms of the material that one can work with, because the material is such a vital conceptual part of art making. Here's some more examples of work created by students under lockdown, and you can see it's a very wide range. Different to other art programs, we also encourage students to think about the digital from the first day onward. So these are kind of color examples or color compositions that students did by using digital software. In this case, I suspect it was Illustrator. So we realized that despite the fact that a student might want to work very much with their hand skills, with charcoal, with ink, we also see the value in the contemporary art world of understanding digital production methods, as these can often be integrated in quite interesting ways into one's artistic practice. Here we see something was made by a combination of different objects that were found and put together. So here's just some more examples, just to give you an even larger sense of the possibilities of art making that we look at, from creating sculptural objects that resemble desserts to completely transforming environments through interactive installations that have components of sound. This installation even had a specific spot that was designed so that viewers can have a rest on a little mat there and even take a nap if they need to. It was really dealing with the kind of complexity and fast-paced nature of life. So there's so many different ways that one can make art, and we allow the space for students to explore all of these different avenues in the process of kind of defining themselves as artists. Video and performance art is something that is so current and so popular within contemporary art practices, and many students kind of explore different ways in which they can use themselves as the material, how they can use themselves as actor, as object, as performer, as movement practitioner, in different ways of expressing their kind of conceptual concerns. Sculptural practices, which can range from more traditional kind of clay objects to more kind of site-specific installations, to various different ways in which we create either ephemeral objects or more sturdy objects or transient objects. We look at the language of objects within the field of contemporary art as well. We also look at the importance of text and textile and digital practices as well. And then painting. Despite the fact that we have a very contemporary focus, that doesn't mean that we completely neglect painting, because painting has such an important role in the art world still. Despite the fact that paintings might not be the kind of classical paintings that we used to from the history of art, we find that there's so many different reinterpretations of what paintings mean in our contemporary world. Even painting not with paint but with fabric, by combining objects in a way that has a painterly quality to it, but it's not constructed out of paint. Or a painting that could become a sculptural object. And there's so many different possibilities in the combination of media. And then we also look at photographic and video practices, which are ways of capturing images in such a way that they communicate quite conceptually the concerns that we might have. So that, in a nutshell, is really what we look at in contemporary art. And I'm sure some of you might have questions, but before we get to the questions, having spoken so much about exhibitions, I think it's only a great time to remind you again of our first Thursday exhibition that's going to happen on the 5th of November, called The Silence Is Not Empty As I Thought. In this case, it's not the work of contemporary art students that will be shown, but the work of our photography students. But we're very much using the same kind of curatorial practices to explore a conceptual concern in this exhibition. So you're welcome to pop in on the 5th to come and see that if you'd like. Is there any questions that I could answer at this point around contemporary art specifically? No one? So we mentioned in a previous session